Hello, my name is Tom Goreau. I'm the president of the Global Coral Reef Alliance. En español, mi nombre es Tomás Joaquín Goreau Arango. Yo soy de Jamaica y de Panama y de Cuba, lejos. I'm going to speak in English, unfortunately, and I'm going to be talking about the changes in the Mesoamerican reefs and trying to show you the oldest underwater photographs from that area, which have never been seen before in public. Let me find the screen I want to share with you. Sorry about that. Okay, here is a map of coral reefs of the Caribbean. I think if you can see the screen, you'll see my cursor moving, and I'm going to be talking here about Cozumel and the reefs in the area of Key Cochrane, San Pedro, Belize, and off in the outer islands here of the so-called atolls of Belize. I've dived all around the Caribbean myself ever since I was a small boy. And it turns out that I have the world's largest collection of underwater coral photographs in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s because my father and grandfather took them. They were the only people in the world photographing those kinds of marine reefs in those days. And you can see behind me some of the pictures up on the wall as some of the first high-quality underwater photographs were ever taken by my grandfather in the Bahamas in 1948. So we've been doing this a long time. It turns out that a number of years ago, a lady contacted me, and what she said was that her husband, whose name was I've got to check that here, was Robert Harper. He was an early diver, and he went down to Cozumel and Belize to photograph reefs in the very beginning of the diving industry when the first dive shops opened. And so these are, as far as we know, some of the oldest pictures of coral reefs in either Cozumel or Belize. And that's what I'm going to show you so you understand what they look like. And they were taken in 1968 by Robert Harper. When he died, his wife was clearing out his remains, and she was ready to throw the material out. And she said, maybe there's someone who cares about old pictures and saving them. And she tracked me down and she sent me the photographs. I've had them for many years, and I've never had a chance to show them except once in Cozumel to the oldest divers in Cozumel. Okay, at this point, I'm going to now switch to, how did I do that? To the underwater pictures of Cozumel. They were taken in 1968 because I'd like you to see how Cozumel looked underwater back in those days. And as far as we know, these are about the oldest underwater pictures. There may be a few older. I'll talk about that in a minute. But these are the oldest ones we know. And I had them for many years. And then in the late 1990s, I went to Cozumel and I took these pictures and I went to meet the oldest divers in Cozumel. And they're the people who are in these pictures. They're the people who dived with this guy because they worked for the very first dive shop in Cozumel, which is Aqua Safari. And so these were the founders of Aqua Safari who were beginning their dive career, making Cozumel into a major dive center. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly so you have some idea. The colors are faded, but this is old film. But what you see is the abundance of corals everywhere. There's no algae to be seen in these pictures anywhere. There are corals everywhere. This is on the famous Palancar Wall, which was the most famous dive spot in Cozumel because it goes very deep and it's a steep slope. And as you see, it was really pretty wonderful in those days. It's not like that anymore. Most of these corals now are dead. And what you see all over the bottom is algae. It's smothered with algae. The sponges have increased a lot since those days. The sponges are kind of taking over. So the whole reef has changed. Okay, now I'm going to go back 1 second. And I'd like to show you some photographs here. Oh, man. Hold on. Oh, I see what's happened. 1 second. Okay, I'd like to show you some photographs now. This is Ramon Bravo. He was famous for being one of the first divers in Mexico. He began diving very early in Isla Mujeres, and he loved diving. And he went and he was the first underwater photographer in Mexico. He was the first underwater filmer in Mexico. He made a lot of famous movies, James Bond movies and stuff like that. He dived and he found the cave of the sleeping shark, and he studied the sharks off Isla Mujeres for years. Later, Captain Cousteau came and filmed the cave of the sleeping shark, where Ramon showed it to him, and Captain Cousteau claimed credit for having discovered it. Ramon was really a hero. He was really someone who loved diving, and he loved to save the reef, and he was photographing everywhere. He died before I came to Mexico, very shortly before I first came to Mexico. I never had a chance to meet him, but I met his wife soon afterwards, Maria, and she lived in his house in Isla Mujeres. Ramon died. He was electrocuted, tragically, in his own house. And his wife, Maria, didn't have any money. She couldn't afford to pay for electricity. She couldn't afford to fix the roof. He lived in a beautiful house. A beautiful house. It was a palapa. Palapas covered with palm leaves. And Maria didn't have the money to fix them. So the rain came through the roof, and Ramon's entire collection of priceless, historic underwater photographs of Mexico and his films, the first underwater films in Mexico, were all sitting there being ruined by the rain leaking through the roof. So when I first met Maria, I tried to help her to save them. And we tried to get this material protected and documented and scanned. And I went and I spent several days in Ramon's house going through all his old photographs of the reefs in Isla Mujeres and Cozumel and up and down the Cancun area. Now, mind you, in those days, underwater photography was very difficult, very difficult. And what people like Ramon were mainly filming was themselves and their friends catching big fish, because big fish were everywhere in the reef. The reefs were full of corals. I sat for several days in Ramon's house, and I went through all of his old photographs, looked through every one of them to look at what they showed of the reefs. And mostly the reefs were backdrops behind fishermen spearing big fish. But what you could see was forests of corals that lined the whole coast of Isla Mujeres and Cozumel that are now gone. They're disappeared. Those photographs were the only record of them. We tried to save them, and as far as I know, they were lost. They were lost. There wasn't the funding. We couldn't find the funding to save them and protect them and get them protected. But I did look through all of them. So Ramon was a real hero, and there's a statue of him in Isla Mujeres. Ramon trained a lot of the first Mexican divers who went there to Isla Mujeres to dive with them. This was one of them, Sergio Sandoval, who died recently. He was a master diver in Cozumel. He was born in Jalisco, but he knew everything. He had a tremendous collection of old photographs of Cozumel reefs that I hope have been protected. I mean, he was a very wise man and a very good friend of mine. I showed all these pictures to him and the first divers in Aqua Safari, Bill Horn, who's now the owner, or was later the owner at the first dive shop, Sergio. And they could recognize the corals and the soft corals in those pictures. They said, oh, that one's still there. That sponge is gone. And they could recognize exactly where every one of these photographs were taken, because they were actually some of the people in the photograph. So Sergio was a real Cozumel hero, and unfortunately he's gone, but he did everything he could to protect the reefs. Another person who died with Ramon Bravo and Sergio Sandoval was Pico Castello, who was from Veracruz and began diving there as a young man and just loved diving. He worked for Dive Paradise. Pico was a very good friend of mine, and then I can't find any photographs of him, or I would show them to you. But we set up coral reef protection projects in Cozumel, and we started growing corals in front of Dive Paradise, the dive place that they went from. And they worked fine until one day a dolphin aquarium attraction, swim with dolphins attraction, moved in right next door. As soon as they brought the dolphins in, suddenly the whole reef began to be smothered with slimy red and purple growths of cyanobacteria, the kind of slime that you see around sewage outfalls. And we watched as they overgrew and smothered the bottom and killed the corals and wiped out our coral reef restoration project. And then a hurricane hit Cozumel, and they removed the dolphins, and then the weedy algae went away. So we could see there was a problem. Now, I'm going to show you a picture of what happens. These are the kind of slimy algae that overgrew our area. And this is from the wall of the dolphinarium in Chancanab, where the water flows out. It's all slimy with the stuff, and it was overgrowing coral reefs for kilometers downstream. Any place we put nutrients in the water, whether it's dolphin excrement, it causes algae growth that kills the reef. In most places, the major source is human sewage. For instance, in Cancun, where millions of people's sewage is hardly treated at all before it's dumped into the sea. And that's why there's algae all over the bottom, smothering and killing the reefs, all around Cancun, all across the Costa Maya. Cozumel was protected for a long time from this sort of thing because it's out in the open water. And it's where all the water from the Caribbean that's blown by the Gulf Stream piling west ends up, and where the Gulf Stream starts and the currents start pushing it north. So Cozumel was one of the last places to be affected by this. And Cozumel really protected their groundwater, their fresh water, because they had so little of it. So what they did is they dumped all the sewage off at the north end of the island, which was just killed by algae overgrowth, but they kept the west side where the divers was pretty clean. But when the dolphinariums moved in, that changed. The dolphinariums became the major source of sewage of the water. And now what they're doing is they're extending the development in Cozumel further south towards Colombia. And all of that, none of that sewage goes into the sewage system at all. It goes straight down to the ground. It washes out into the reef. And now Cozumel reefs are being killed by algae overgrowth from both ends, from the north, where the sewage outfall is, and from the south, where all the sewage goes. It doesn't go into the sewage outfall. So it's a big problem. It's a very big problem. It's one we warned people would happen. And the tragedy is that Cozumel's tourism was built on the beauty of the reef, the exceptional beauty of the reef. It's the world's #1 dive attraction. People go there because the reefs, the slopes, the current, it was really remarkable. But it's being ruined by greed, by the fact that people won't treat their sewage properly, and the water quality deterioration is destroying the reef. On top of that, we have coral bleaching due to global warming. That's due to high temperatures. And on top of that, we have new diseases spreading like mad. They've been spreading across the Caribbean for more than 20 years. They're not really new. They've been changing as they go, but they're killing the few remaining corals. So we've lost most of our corals. That's a sad thing. That's a very sad thing. Okay, now at this point, I'd like to go back, and I'd like to talk a bit about Belize, because what I told you is a tragedy of overdevelopment, that every place people find beautiful reefs and they want to profit from them by bringing in tourism, and where they don't deal with the long-term consequences, they wind up killing their resource. And that's what's happening, I'm sad to say, in the tourist areas of Quintana Roo, with Cozumel being one of the last affected, but it's beginning to go too. They can still turn it around if they treat their sewage properly, and stop global warming, but it's a very difficult task. Okay, now I'm going to switch to Belize, which is further south. And Bob Harper in 1968, after he dived in Belize with the first dive, in Cozumel with the first dive shop in Cozumel, he went down to Belize, and these are some of the pictures that he found. Let me 1 second. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Belize. Beg pardon. Okay. These photographs were taken in Belize at several locations, near San Pedro and Key Cocker, and out in the outer islands, the outer atolls, Glover's Reef in particular, which was very beautiful in those days. And I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but what they show was a paradise full of live, hard coral covering the bottom everywhere you looked. these pictures aren't terribly sharp, you had to focus every picture individually. So it was very hard to take underwater pictures. There are very few people who could take them. And this was the very beginnings of underwater photography when the reefs were beautiful. Now we have incredible cameras that take beautiful pictures, but these reefs are gone, many of them for the most part. That's a sad thing. Now, these pictures were taken in 1968, and these reefs in 1961 were devastated by a Category 5 hurricane, Hurricane Hattie, in 1961, which was the worst hurricane still that has ever hit Belize. It flattened all the branching corals, the ones you see here. These are the corals that had grown back in 8 years, that come back in 8 years after they've been flattened by the hurricane. So you have some idea of how rich the reef was and how quickly it recovered from natural damage. We don't see that anymore. I'm going to now switch to here, and I'm going to show you, this is the track of Hurricane Hattie in 1961. It did something like what Hurricane Iota did in many ways. It began down in the south. It slammed into Belize with full force and devastated the reef, crossed Guatemala, then came back and hit Mexico from the Pacific, crossed back into the Caribbean, and then almost doubled back and nearly hit Yucatan a third time. So it was a very unusual hurricane. And just before that hurricane hit, Robert Trench, the fellow here in the middle, Bob Trench, who's my adopted brother, that's me next to him, left Belize and he came to Jamaica to study and learn. He became my father's student and basically a member of my family. So Bob used to dive on all these reefs when he was a boy. He's the last person who remembers how they were. His family were fishermen in Key Cocker, and they used to go out and dive the reefs. And so this was the first time he'd seen the reefs he grew up on as a boy. This picture was taken just after I showed him the picture. He's the only person who's ever seen these pictures that I just showed you. And he's the only person really left who remembers. He's the most famous scientist Belize has ever produced. Now, I do want to say that there are solutions. We know how to clean up water quality if we treat our sewage and stop throwing it in the water. We know how to reverse global warming if we only did the right thing with regard to CO2 and global energy policy. We don't really know what to do about the new diseases, just like we don't know what to do with COVID, because the viruses and the bacteria and these viruses that are killing the corals now, they can evolve much faster than we can. So that's a serious problem. We know it's linked to human activity, but we don't really know how to stop it. We don't have vaccines for corals. So that's a big issue. And if you look at these reefs, this is a picture for corals we are growing on a biorock reef in Cozumel. This picture was taken a few days ago. And this picture is a project by Dr. Herman Mendez, who is a hero. He's the guy trying to grow back the corals in Cozumel. And this is a little biorock reef. I'm not going to talk much about biorock reefs, but it's a technology we invented in Jamaica to grow back reefs. And here we're growing a few corals. But if you look at the background, that reef was a reef full of branching corals like what I showed you in those old pictures. It's gone completely gone. So we have a big task ahead of us. We want to grow it back. Now, what we're trying to do in this picture is our method, what's unique about it is that we greatly increase the settlement, the growth, and the resistance to extreme environmental stresses of corals and all marine organisms. So we're able to keep corals alive through bleaching events when they would die. We're able to grow them back where they're not recovering. And this is something we have to do. In Mexico now, there are many people fragmenting and breaking corals. Every time a hurricane hits, people go out and pick up the fragments and they glue them back. And they mean well. They're really trying to do the right thing to propagate corals. The problem is that they die because of water quality. The water gets too hot, it gets too polluted, it gets too muddy, and the corals die. And no matter how much you break them into little pieces and glue them all over the place, they're going to die if you don't clean up the water quality. The difference with our method is our corals survive those conditions. They're just stronger and faster growing, and they're able to resist it. So what we're really hoping to do is to expand this technology all up and down the Mesoamerican reef, working with the fishing communities, in particular, the people who live off the reefs. I'm afraid that tourism hasn't really done the right thing. Tourism has been focused on profit rather than long-term environmental sustainability. And I just hope the fishermen take a long-term point of view. But if we don't, we're going to lose our remaining reefs. And if we don't start using methods that effectively propagate the corals instead of just breaking them into little pieces and watching them die, we're not going to be able to come back. We're really in a marine crisis, and our shore protection, our biodiversity, and our fisheries and our tourism is all endangered because of it. So if we want those economic resources back, if we want a blue economy, we're going to have to regrow our living coastal resources